Welcome to BIMS TV. My name is Loni Matthew, and this is BIMS Bites. Today, we will take a look at Pacific mole crabs and microplastics. Microplastics are exactly what they sound like, really small pieces of plastic. They're categorized into two separate components as to better identify them. Primary microplastics are already manufactured. So think, for example, the microbeads in your body wash or polyester fibers in your t-shirt. Secondary microplastics are big pieces of plastics that have broken down into a really small size. Just like the cap off of a water bottle or a plastic shard, they eventually corrode down to such a small size that they are then considered microscopic. So today we'll take a look at the relationship between these plastics and a small crab that lives all along the Pacific coastline. The Pacific mole crab is a small crab whose sole purpose is to dig in the sand. They are suspension feeders, which means that they extract their food from the surrounding water with their antenna. This makes them a perfect indicator species because we can assess the health of the surrounding environment by assessing the health of the crab. As you can imagine, a lot of suspension feeders ingest these microplastics thinking they are organic material, just like the Pacific mole crab. And today we'll explore a little bit more about how it affects their physiology. Microplastics and microfibers are a very common pollutant in oceans and sand. Because they're suspension feeders, it is hard for them to decipher whether something is actually edible or inedible. As they ingest these plastics, the result is hypothesized to have them inhibit their digging performance and in turn makes them more vulnerable to predators such as seagulls, for example. Now let's take a look at the San Francisco Bay Area as a regional contributor to microplastic pollution. Manufacturing centers produce debris in bulk, which make their way into the Pacific by way of wind, stormwater, river, and wastewater. It is important to note that even though it is so far inland, it still does not inhibit its influence in the ocean. So now let's take a closer look at where these crabs live. Pacific mole crabs live all along the Pacific coast, which is how they get their name, but it includes North, Central, and South America, even far south as Chile. On the beach, they live on the swash zone, which is where the water meets the shore and where the waves come back and forth. So now let's visualize how this actually works. When the tide comes in, it brings in a new batch of food for them to eat from. They cannot decipher whether something is organic or inorganic material, so they just eat as the food comes. Unfortunately, this means they ingest a lot more plastics than they were intending to, and it causes them to have adverse effects. The outcomes of ingesting these microplastics is that they are hypothesized to have delayed digging speeds. In turn, they are more susceptible to predation, which means that the animal that consumes them will also have the plastic that they have accumulated. So for example, seagulls are a very common predator of the Pacific mole crab. When these crabs ingest these microplastics, the seagull will then have the same accumulation of those plastics in its own body. This would be called bioaccumulation, and this is a huge problem for all types of animals along the food chain. In my research, I plan to dive into this problem a bit deeper and see what the true repercussions of microplastic ingestion can be. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me at any of these 4 handles, and I would love to have a conversation with you. Finally, I would like to thank Black and Marine Science for this opportunity, and feel free to connect with them at any of these handles. Thank you so much.